Hi, everyone. Welcome to Pagan Happy Hour. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Today, we are going to be talking about Yule, and specifically, we're going to look at how the Norse pagans may have historically celebrated this holiday. And then we're going to look at a few traditions we commonly associate with Christmas and this time of year and see if they do, in fact, have some origins in Old Norse culture. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. And if you are new here, welcome. I do Pagan Happy Hour every Friday at 5 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Eastern. And if you are new here and you might not be aware, this is really meant to be a way for us pagans to all connect and share ideas and resources. So I am going to be looking over here at the chat as we're going along. I'm going to be bringing in your thoughts and your ideas into the conversation as well. And there are two ways you can support the show if you are interested. The first way is through my Patreon, which I have linked down below. And if you do choose to become a patron, you also gain access to my exclusive Discord community, which is full of fellow pagans and witches. And it's a great place to just connect with other people and share stories and pictures and resources and things like that. The other great way you can support the show is through Super Chats, which is the $ button at the bottom of the chat box. And through that, you can donate any amount, and your question or comment will pop up really big for me. So I'll be sure to bring your thoughts into the conversation as we are going along. So now that we got that out of the way, I would love for you all in the comments to share with me where you are watching from and what you happen to be drinking tonight. So let me cue that drink music and we'll get started. So today I am having a IPA in my nice drinking horn. I thought it was very fitting for our episode today about Yule. And I can see people chiming in from, Colorado, from Canada, from England, from Alaska, Pennsylvania, Northern Nevada. Another England, another Colorado, Massachusetts, Finland. Ohio, Miami, California, London, Illinois, Michigan, Florida, Tahoe, Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Northern California. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope you all are really excited that Yule is creeping up on us. It seems like it's just around the corner. And if you're not familiar, the majority of pagans, but not all pagans, tend to celebrate Yule on the winter solstice, which I believe this year is on Tuesday, the 21st. The date of the solstice actually changes a little bit. It's either on the 20th, the 21st, or the 22nd. So there is a bit of variation, but I'll definitely be celebrating on the actual winter solstice myself. But there are so many great ways to celebrate this season. And even if you're not pagan or Norse pagan, it's just a festive time. So thank you guys all for chiming in, telling me what you're drinking and where you're from. And now we're going to jump into the chat. Let me turn off my music here and have a sip of my beer. And we're going to get started. We're going to be digging deep into some interesting historical stuff. So I hope you're ready to get a bit nerdy tonight. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to chat about was the actual word Yule, or in Old Norse, Yule. And this is an interesting word, and it technically means parties, which suggests something kind of unusual, that Yule is not one particular day or one particular festival, but actually a series of events and festivities. And this is something you'll find for a lot of different pagan celebrations. If you've watched my videos on other pagan holidays like Beltane or Lunasa, I usually mention that often these aren't single celebrations, but a series of events where people tend to come together In the ancient world, maybe different tribes or groups would come together to celebrate. So it's good to think of Yule not as a day of the winter solstice, but as actually a season or a series of different events. So keep that in mind. Another thing we need to mention before we jump into details is our information when it comes to how Yule was celebrated by the Norse pagans is quite a bit spotty. The Norse pagans didn't write that much down. Now, yes, they did have a written system, the runes, which I'm sure you are pretty familiar with, which they used as kind of an alphabet. But the vast amount of things they wrote down using runes wasn't really about their daily life. It wasn't about their religious festivals. It wasn't about their ceremonies. It was usually more about commemorating someone's life who had passed on. That's where you'll actually find the most runic inscriptions. So that's great, and it tells us a lot about the people and their accomplishments, but doesn't really tell us much about how they celebrated the holidays or what their views were about spiritual concepts and the gods and the goddesses and all of that kind of stuff. What we know about that comes much later. So when you visit Scandinavia today, and you might see these large, giant stones with carvings that are called Rune Stones. Yes, they have some information we can glean from those, but it's usually kind of a commemorative, almost gravestone, the vast majority of those. So not much to go on in terms of how Yule was celebrated. But what we do know is in large part thanks to an Icelandic scholar. His name was Snorri Sturluson. And he wrote the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, which you're probably pretty familiar with. That's basically the collection of the Norse myths. And he did happen to also write down quite a few things about how Yule was celebrated. But the problem is Snorri Sturluson existed in a post-Christianization time. So this is about 200 years after the Viking Age. So he is basing these written materials on hearsay and what he's heard and seen from the local populace. So we don't always know how accurate his comments and statements would be. I do also have a few pieces of source material from things that were written in a pre-Christian time, which we'll get to, but keep in mind, everything is going to be with a grain of salt here. So don't take my word as exact. The sources we're working with are very limited, very biased, and often written after most people were fully Christianized. So keep that in mind. Now, one thing that you're probably already familiar with if you are pagan or have been watching my channel for a while is that this time of year and the celebration of Yule is in a lot of ways about the sun, right? Because if you follow the sun at the winter solstice, it is the shortest day of the year. And thus it's the darkest time of the year, right? And after the winter solstice, the days start to get longer and longer and longer and longer. So this was a really important time for many ancient peoples, and they marked both the winter and the summer solstice, usually with some kind of festive celebration, not just the Norse pagans, many cultures around the world, and even societies that were really old. So if you look at, for example, the stone circles in Britain that were created basically thousands of years before the Druids, those are often aligned to points like the solstice. So this time period was very important for cultures, not just in Europe even, but all around the world. So many pre-Christian societies followed the movement of the sun and marked that winter solstice point. But I think it's interesting here with the Norse pagans specifically because they weren't super obsessed with the sun in the way that some other pagan societies were. For example, the Egyptians, right? Ra or Aten, the sun deity was such a huge part of their cosmology. And the stories of the sun gods were so vital to the populace and how they saw their place in the world. So the sun was clearly a massive deity for the ancient Egyptians. Or even you could look at a culture like the Mayans or the Aztecs, where the sun also played a huge role. So the question is, how important was the sun as a deity to the Norse pagans? And how important was it to celebrate the sun specifically at this time of year? Now, if you've read the Norse myths, you'll probably not remember coming across a sun deity at all. There is one, and it's actually a goddess. Sol is the name. And so she is a deity in a way, but more kind of a personification of the sun itself, along with the moon, Mani, a god. The sun and the moon were more so used as ways to mark time. They themselves, as deities, didn't really feature in many of the sagas. So we know that the sun and the moon weren't that important in a religious way in terms of being part of the wider Norse pantheon. So that's kind of interesting. At least I think that's interesting. That how do we kind of gauge how important was the winter solstice, to look at how important was the sun, in this case goddess, to the Norse people? And in this case, not that important, most likely. Though, of course, the sun was still very important, especially considering the vast amount of people were farmers. So, of course, the movement of the sun would be important to track when to plant, when to sow, all of that. Of course, it being at midwinter, it would be very dark and not much would be planted, but it would still be an important date for practical reasons, if not religious reasons, to honor. So let me check your comments here while I have a sip of my drink, and then we'll move on to a couple other things about the sun worship aspect of this holiday. Let's see. Awesome. Just checking your comments and questions here. Okay. Let's see. Grace has an interesting point about that in that far north, it gets so dark. So the sun isn't as present in people's lives as it would have been in the Mediterranean or in cultures where the sun god or goddess, depending on the culture, had a more significant role in the religious cosmology. So that's a really good point. Let's see. Just checking your thoughts and your ideas. Okay, so one other thing to think about is, yes, the sun god goddess wasn't that important possibly to the Norse pagans, but sun symbolism was. Now you might be familiar with the solar cross or the solar wheel. This is a popular symbol that you'll find throughout Norse art, and many Norse pagans today use certain variations of the sun cross or the sun wheel on their altar, for example. So those symbols were vitally important and a bit mysterious. No one fully knows exactly what the purpose of these symbols were, what exactly they represent. I mean, it's likely they did have to do with the movement of the sun, hence the name sun wheel or sun cross, but it's still a bit of an unknown. We do know they go way back. I believe there is a sun cross all the way from I think it's like almost 5,000 BCE or something. I think it's from Denmark, made out of wood, I believe. So these sun crosses were created by the Norse pagans for a very long time. So we know that that symbol at least had a significant part to play in their religious and spiritual beliefs. And so if you see those around in various Norse pagan websites, you'll know at least that many of those have a pretty complicated, but also a very long backstory. So we do have one written source from pre-Christian times that actually describes Norse pagans celebrating the sun at the solstice. And this specific example is from the 6th century. And this was written by a Byzantine chronicler. His name was, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but it's Procopius. And he visited a land called Thule in the 6th century. So Thule is obviously not a term you're very familiar with. It's not Sweden or Norway or Denmark. It basically was a term that meant the land beyond the borders of the known world, or the land far to the north, the land at the edge of the map. They used to call all of this land that was unknown to people in the Middle East or the Mediterranean Thule. So this Byzantine scholar visits a land of Thule in the 6th century, and he observes the Norse pagans celebrating the solstice. And I did bring that quote because I think it's interesting to actually see a source, And so he says, around the time of the winter solstice, the sun is never to be seen on this island for 40 days, but the eternal night encloses it. And when 35 days have passed in this long night, certain men are sent up to the top of the mountains because that is their custom. When those men barely can see the sun from that point, they return to the village with the message that within 5 days the sun will shine on them again. The people would then celebrate a party about 20 days after the winter solstice, and this would be the biggest party held by the natives at Thule. So this is interesting, especially for the date aspect, if you caught that. They were celebrating about 20 days after the solstice, which fits in with what we were talking about early on when we mentioned the word Yule in Old Norse meant parties, plural. So this was a month-long kind of celebration where it sounds like the biggest party actually took place around 20 days after the solstice. And that would be the Yule blot or the Yule sacrifice, most likely. So that's what we're going to get into next. But I also think one of the clues here that he was probably talking about somewhere in Scandinavia is his comment that the sun basically ceases from view in the daytime, as we know occurs around midwinter in Scandinavia, where there's basically no sun for a while. So it's likely he was actually visiting the Norse pagan people and writing about this celebration that occurred post winter solstice. So that's cool. If we're looking for source material, obviously he himself was not pagan. He was just writing about customs, but at least the time period checks out, as opposed to Snorri Sturluson, who wrote much later about the Norse pagans. So when we think about when was this party, so if you really want to celebrate Yule, say you're a Norse pagan, and you want to kind of celebrate it in a bit of a historic way, probably we shouldn't be having our big celebration on the solstice, but after. And some people have analyzed the calendar system. For the most part, the Norse pagans were on a lunar calendar, but then there were some kind of variations because a lunar calendar doesn't exactly add up to 365. So it's this big complicated mess I'm not going to get into. But there is a theory here that how they would actually plan out the Yule blot or the Yule sacrifice festive days would be based on the first full moon following a new moon after the winter solstice. So you have the winter solstice, and then there has to be the new moon, and then the full moon. And that full moon is when you would have the Yule blot or the Yule sacrifice. So say the winter solstice happens and then there's a full moon the day after. Not then. You have to wait for one full cycle. So you have to wait for the new moon and then the full moon. And then on that full moon, you have your big festival. So if you're trying to plan out a community event or for yourself a particular day to honor the Norse gods for Yule, keep that in mind because that's something we can still figure out today. I didn't quite look it up yet. You might have to look it up for me when that full moon will be. So after the winter solstice, the new moon, and then the full moon, what particular date it will be this year. But that would be a great time to honor the Norse gods, as it's most likely, though we're not for sure here, most likely the time where the big sacrifice to honor the Norse gods would be. Now we do know also a fair bit about this Yule sacrifice or this Yule blot from Snorri Sturluson. So I'll bring his thoughts and ideas in too, even though they might be a little bit less accurate. But before I bring in his details on how the Norse pagans celebrated that Yule sacrifice, let me check your comments. And if you have anything else to bring into this conversation or pieces of information you've picked up, of course, feel free to share your thoughts too. Let's see. Oh, okay, awesome. Just checking your thoughts. Okay, interesting comment here. It says, do you think the less focus on the sun worship has to do more with the greater importance on ancestor worship? That's a good point because the Norse pagans found ancestor worship to be a key part of their belief system. So that's very possible. It's a good comment. Let's see. Interesting comment here from AF that says, the passage tombs in Europe from the megalithic age were the ones that celebrated the solstice on the very day. I'm all for syncretism in that regard. That's a good point. Now, it is highly likely that like those old passage tombs and stone circles that are aligned to the solstice, they were probably celebrating on the actual solstice. So just because this Yule sacrifice date may occur after the winter solstice, that doesn't mean you have to celebrate then. You're welcome to celebrate at any time that you would like. Let's see. The G-Man is asking in the comments, didn't they sacrifice goats and a boar? That's what we're getting next to. That's what we're getting to next. So conflicting reports here. Snorri Sturluson says that they sacrificed a horse and they would take a portion of the horse's blood, and the vova, who would be like a shaman or a witch, perhaps, she would take sticks and dip the sticks in the blood and kind of like flick it at the people celebrating, at images of the deities, to kind of bless them with that sacrificial horse blood. So that's the main theory, at least, that it was most likely a horse that was sacrificed, which makes sense if you think back in the day and you want to make a really big sacrifice. A horse would be pretty significant sacrifice because that's a very important and expensive animal for an ancient people. Though we actually do have archaeological evidence that suggests that a pig or boar was sacrificed on this day. So If it was a pig or boar, that's extra interesting because it kind of makes me think of Freya, who is also associated with the boar. So maybe a boar being sacrificed to honor Freya in hopes of, fertile fields and growth in springtime. And also, a pig is a lot easier. If we modern pagans are planning like a Yule meal, it's a lot easier to pick up some pork chops than get some horse, unless you live in like Verona, Italy, where they eat horse. So that's good to know. You can eat pork for Yule if you're interested, and that would probably be a pretty historical meal that was eaten. Though how they would cook it would be in these large vessels over the fire in the kind of long house in the hall, in the great hall, is how they would tend to cook it. Let's see. Oh, and next we want to talk about toasting, which was a huge part of the Yule blot. So we're going to jump into that. Let me have a sip of my drink here. Okay, let me check your comments before moving on to the toasting part. Let's see. Interesting question. Where and when are the 12 days of Christmas, and where did that begin? Good question. That's still something I'm looking into. That has a lot more to do with kind of Christianity, I believe, where it kind of starts around Christmas and then continues on to the night of the Epiphany. And in last week's Pagan Happy Hour, where we talked about Frau Perkta, she was a folkloric witch associated with the day of the Epiphany. But the 12 days of Christmas, each was connected to a certain aspect of Christianity or meant to honor a certain aspect of Christianity. So when you think about it, I mean, it is kind of interesting that now we're talking about Yule having possibly been celebrated over multiple days. And then you look at the 12 days of Christmas, which historically were celebrated around the same time. Maybe there's some connection there. Not positive, but that is something I plan on looking into more. But great question. Let's see. Okay, awesome. Let's see. Okay, so next, let's talk a bit about the toasting, which was a very big deal to the Norse pagans and really to many cultures, and still is today. A very big deal when it comes to festive celebrations. So now, we do know that cups were raised in honor to certain gods. The first cup was raised towards Odin, and then it was raised towards Njord, or the god of the sea. And finally, it was raised towards Frey. So you'd have these three toasts to the gods. Now, then something interesting happens. The participants at the Yule blot would stand up and give their kind of personal toast. And what their personal toast would consist of are the deeds they are going to attempt to do in this new year. So, quite a bit similar to New Year's resolutions in a lot of ways. You can imagine standing up and be like, I am going to do this and this and this and all of these great things. And then they sit back down, and then someone else stands up and, toasts before everyone what they hope to accomplish that year. And you go around and you give all these toasts. Everyone states what their goals and their plans are, which is neat too, because then you know what everyone's goals are, and you can be like, hey, you said at the Yule blot you were going to be doing this. So kind of keep everyone on top of their goal setting that year. And then finally, everyone would raise their cup and toast the ancestors at the very end. So these toasts were a huge deal towards the Norse pagans. And for any Norse pagan today, toasting could probably be a really great thing to incorporate into your own, Yule celebration, whether it's just you alone or even better with other people, because Yule is definitely a time and a celebration meant to be shared with others, in my opinion, at least. Now, there are some other kind of traditions that may have basis in Norse paganism. What I wanted to talk about is presents. Now, the tradition of giving presents at Christmas does go back to pagan times, to several different cultures. Most likely and most prominently, I would say Saturnalia from ancient Rome definitely had a strong gifting tradition at this time of year, though also the Norse pagans would occasionally give gifts at this time of year. Not everyone, and not necessarily to everyone, usually to the Jarl or the king. They might give a gift. And the concept of the gift cycle is also something that's really important in Norse culture, where you give so that you can receive. It's this reciprocal giving. So it's not that you're going to give to someone and then never see them again, or it just ends. It's they now have an obligation to give back to you. So it's kind of this perpetual cycle. So when you think about the toasting and the honoring and the offerings to the deities, you're giving to them so that they can give to you. So this gift cycle concept, I think, was an interesting kind of shift or difference in the mindset of giving than how we today think about giving. Normally we just give presents out. We're not necessarily expecting anything in return always, but for them it was kind of like an obligatory cycle, ensuring that everyone was kind of part of the community. Oh, we have our first super chat from Rachel. Thank you so much. Let's see. She says, I knew that I had just read about the 12 days of Christmas and just found it. It was part of the Feast of Fools, which included mummers and Morris performers. Yes, thank you so much for the super chat, and thank you for sharing. Yeah, the Feast of Fools and the mummers, that's definitely a big part of the 12 days of Christmas. And I believe like the king would nominate someone from the court to be his like head juggler, not necessarily a juggler, but head master of mischief. I think it was called something like that, the master of mischief, whose whole role was during the 12 days to stir up fun and frivolity and festivity. So yeah, it is something I want to research. I don't know how much of it is based in paganism, but there could be a few vestiges there that could be worth exploring. But great comment. And again, thank you so much for the super chat. Let's see. In the comments, Graves is mentioning for the Germanic peoples, there was a boar's head as the traditional feast. And you still see this today with the boar's head, especially in like Tudor times. In England, that was the common thing that was, paraded around the dining hall at Christmas. So the boar's head tradition does, I think, stand strong. Oh, and I have a super chat from Vocatus. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that support. I hope you're enjoying the show today. Let me see what other questions you guys have about this. Oh, I see someone's mentioning it's the Lord of Misrule. That is the name that was given to the member of the court in the 12 days of Christmas. But I definitely do want to discuss mumming traditions in the future. Some of them definitely do have pagan significance, especially like the Mari Lloyd, the horse, creepy horse thing from Wales. So there's a lot to talk about there, which we might do an episode of Pagan Happy Hour on that stuff later on. An interesting comment here from Leah that says Boxing Day, or Servants' Christmas, comes from Saturnalia. The Romans would give their slaves the day off and hold a feast for them. In the Middle Ages, the nobility gave their servants boxes. Okay, so that's where the term Boxing Day comes from. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, that's a good point. This whole kind of topsy-turvy approach to the holiday is something that does go back to Saturnalia and Roman times, where there was that kind of role reversal for the day. Great point. Let's see. Oh, interesting question that asks, was the idea of Valhalla more of a symbolic of a warrior's legacy rather than a literal afterlife for dead warriors? It's tough to say. These stories were written, well after the Christianization. And when we read about Valhalla, I don't really know how people thought of it as if it was a literal place warriors would go to, akin to like you might think of heaven, where your soul actually enters this other realm and you look like yourself and you kind of get to experience this wonderful life at Odin's Hall, or if they viewed it as just a kind of symbolic thing. It's really hard to say. Great question. And it's kind of up to you as a pagan to decide how literal you want to take these things. Let's see. Great questions, guys. Let's see. I did want to mention a few other things that may have Norse pagan origins. So one thing is the Yule Log, which you're probably familiar with. Mostly people like bake Yule logs nowadays, or the bûche de Noël in French. And these, some people say, now before I mention this, I don't know where this source is coming from. So take this part specifically with a grain of salt. But apparently the Norse pagans would cut down a oak tree and carve runes into it. Then it was burned in the home to ask for protection during the winter. And then part of that Yule log was saved till the next Yule to keep the protective powers in the home. So maybe that happened, maybe it didn't. We don't really know. Maybe it almost sounds more Celtic than Norse to me. So maybe it's more of a Celtic thing, the log aspect. But let me know in the comments if you found an actual source on where the Yule log tradition comes from, because I could find plenty of people saying this, but I couldn't trace it back enough to find where the source material for the Yule log tradition is like actually coming from. So maybe that's a thing. If that's a thing you'd like to incorporate, or at least just baking a Yule log, that's a wonderful thing to do for Yule as well. Also, we have the whole mistletoe being used to decorate. Now, I don't know, and I kind of doubt that the Norse pagans would decorate using mistletoe. It's possible, but we do know that mistletoe plays a big role in one particular story about the gods. And I mentioned this story in my Pagan Happy Hour episode a little while ago, where I talked about 3 magical herbs associated, or herbs and plants associated with winter. So mistletoe is significant because it involves Balder and his mother Frigg, who learned that Balder was prophesied to die. So she goes around and asks all the creatures and all the plants to make an oath not to kill him. But then she forgets the mistletoe. So she forgets to ask mistletoe, and then Loki attaches mistletoe to an arrow, and that eventually kills Balder. So her plan didn't work. But there's also a later version of the story where she's able to bring him back to life, and then claims that mistletoe is the plant of love, hence the tradition of kissing under the mistletoe. How much that story is connected to the mistletoe we hang, I'm not quite sure, but I think there's probably a connection there. I mean, I like to think that there is, at least. So there's, of course, that tradition that does have some connection with Norse pagans as well. Okay, let me check your thoughts. You guys are typing away there. I'm sure you have lots of good things to share. Let me have a drink. Interesting. A further point in the comments here about Valhalla. Let's see, Amesworth in the comments says that One thing to remember when talking about Valhalla is the aspect of reincarnation. The soul comes back, just like Thor's hammer. So yeah, I mean, there is this aspect a bit of reincarnation in the Norse cosmology, so that's a bit unique and interesting. So yeah, it's a very complex cosmology, I would say. Let's see. Let's see. Aquarian Harmonics is mentioning mistletoe is more of a Celtic tradition. The Druids saw it as a sacred herb and only harvested it on solstice. So, yeah, maybe the mistletoe tradition more so comes from the Celts than the Norse pagans. Definitely possible. Let's see. Okay, let's see. Uh, And then Graves is also mentioning that mistletoe was probably more important to the Celts. Um, so yeah, it's definitely possible that this whole mistletoe thing is more from the Celtic tradition. Joey in the comments about the Yule Log is mentioning that it is Teutonic as German Wotan and the Wild Hunt. So yeah, maybe the Yule Log tradition is more Germanic than Norse, possibly. There could be some crossover there, definitely. Um, Interesting comment here from Uhtred that says, I know the main log beam holding up the roof in Slavic traditional homes was considered sacred and had symbols burned in it. Ooh, I wonder what symbols. I should look that up. Very neat. Let's see. And I see some people are asking about the Yule log as if it was something that was meant to burn for 12 days or if it was this really big log and took several days to burn. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how that would have specifically been burned. If it was more like each member of the community got their own piece of the tree as their Yule log, that then they burned some of it and kept some in the home, or if it was kind of this more communal large fire, possibly. Fires are, of course, a key thing to many European pagan festivals, especially. I talked a lot about this in terms of belting with those big bonfires. And many of the fire festivals, people would extinguish the fire in their personal home, take a torch, take it to the communal fire, and then use that to relight their own personal hearth as kind of a way of symbolizing being a member of the community. We're all in this together. So the whole concept of burning logs, of bonfires, of coming together is definitely one of those cornerstone key facets of pagan celebration. And I'm really excited. Once I move into my new home, I'm going to get a fire pit so I can finally do some of this stuff myself. That, and I'm going to have 4 fireplaces, which I'm going to. They're not functional now, but I'm going to make them all functional so I can have lots of fire hearth magic going on, which I'll of course share with you guys as soon as I move in. Here's a question. Did pagans put a star on the top of pine trees? I don't think so. I think that probably comes much later. But good question. Let's see. What else do we have? Let's see. Someone's asking about if I'll cover the topic of wassailing during Yule this year. I did a video about wassailing last year, so I recommend checking that out, where I go into the history of wassailing, which actually now we do it around Yuletide, but it was actually more of a Mabon or an autumn equinox time activity back in the day. So it's definitely kind of shifted in time, but you can definitely still do wassailing. Wassailing's neat because it's the name of a drink. You can drink wassail. It's kind of a spiced wine beverage that possibly actually goes back to ancient Rome. There's a beverage called like Hippocras that many think Ren wine is based on, and then wassail is based on Ren wine. So it's a drink. It's also a cheer. You say wassail, and then you say good hail. So it means like, drink and be merry, basically. And that's a pretty old word coming from that And then it's also an activity. You go door to door and you cheers and you sing. So wassailing is a super interesting and kind of ancient thing that I hope people are still doing today. I know not many people do, but I definitely make wassail and drink it at the holidays. Let's see. Oh, I see an interesting comment here that says Iceland holds the tradition of bonfires during Yuletide. Not sure if it's one night only or just the end. That's interesting. And I also know, gosh, what is it? I think it's the Faroe Islands where they use early January, I think, as a big fire festival where they honor Vikings, basically, or many people in the Faroe Islands have like Viking ancestry. So they do like a big Viking fest and they choose that kind of time in early January that would be around the time probably of the Yule Blot. So that's kind of neat too. Let's see. Oh, Uhtred has a comment here. There is a drink recipe for Christmas called Smoking Bishop, made with wine, cloves, and orange boiled into it. Yes, I recently learned about Smoking Bishop. There's actually a line in Christmas Carol where they are drinking Smoking Bishop. So I was curious on what it was, and I looked it up. And yeah, I plan on making it. It's kind of similar to the mulled wine concept. But you put cloves inside of an orange, and then you kind of bake the orange, and then you put it in the hot wine. So sounds very wonderful for this time of year. Leah's asking, does the bonfire in early January have a connection to fireworks on New Year's? Probably not, because I think of fireworks more associated with Chinese Lunar New Year because fireworks come from China. Could be wrong there, but yeah, I think that's where we get the whole fireworks tradition from. Let's see. I see a couple of you guys mentioning being interested in African paganism and voodoo. So that's something that I only know a little bit about. So I probably won't dig too much into African paganism or voodoo on this channel, in part because I feel like a little bit awkward as a white person, sharing this stuff online on my channel. And I feel like it's probably not my place to do that, that someone else could probably do a better job with that. And I know that ancestor stuff is pretty important for voodoo. So obviously I don't have any African ancestors. So I probably won't do too much content about African paganism, though it is something I'm interested in. And there has been a bit of a resurgence in certain African spiritual systems and pagan religions, which I'm really excited to see. And I hope that continues because there's some really fascinating stuff there. Especially like with, voodoo here in the South and especially in New Orleans. I think that's also becoming more popular. So, I think that's something that's going to continue to grow and expand here in the States, which is really exciting. But yeah, thanks for asking. Let's see. Oh my goodness, just checking all your thoughts and ideas. And we do have, it looks like about 10 minutes or so left. So of course, now's a good time if you have any questions about Yule, paganism in general. Feel free to chime in. If you found the content valuable, please consider subscribing or doing a super chat donation. That really helps me a lot and ensures that the channel can continue as we go along. Let's see. Oh, Henry's asking if I can go into Krampus a little bit. So I'm a big fan of Krampus traditions. I recommend linked down below, I've listed all of my Yule videos I've made in the past, which are like over 20. And several of them are specifically about Krampus. So check those out where I give a lot of information on Krampus. And also check out last week's Frau Perchta video because She is strongly connected to Krampus traditions as well. Something I'm really interested in, and I definitely have to get to the Alps, have to get to Germany at some point, so I can actually go and attend a Krampus run. Let's see. Jen is asking, what other gods or goddesses would you celebrate around Yule? This is a good question. So we know, from the toasting, people were toasting Odin, Njord, and Frey. I would probably do those just because we have some historical precedent for that. And then also feel free to add on other deities that you personally feel connected to. Any deity strongly connected to winter, darkness, or death is probably a good deity to work with at this time as well. The winter solstice is the darkest time of the year. So if you do work with certain deities from different pantheons, say like you work with Hades or something like that, like it could be a good time to honor him at the darkest point of the year. Or if you work with any, thinking of, I'm blanking on the name, like the Egyptian goddess of night. What's her name? Oh, it'll come to me later. But so any deity associated with that darkness, but then you also kind of have the rebirth of the sun, so you can even go with a sun deity too. So it's this interesting dichotomy, and maybe having symbols for both darkness and lightness on your altar would be really cool. Honoring kind of with maybe like a black candle and a white candle or something like that to show the return of the sun, but then also to honor the dark night, and any deity you connect with those things. So yeah, great question. Let's see. Uhtred has a good one. He says, I have a minor god for Yule season. It's a Ukrainian demigod named Korochun. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, who is the bringer of frost and will bless you if you are hardy and choose to enjoy cold weather. That's a great one. And of course, we talked about Frau Perkta last Pagan Happy Hour, so leave a bowl out of porridge for her if you want to honor her. So let's see. Oh, and the Yule Goat, the Yule Bach. You can honor the Yule Bach as well. I see someone asking me if I have if I should burn one during Yule. I probably wouldn't burn one. You can. There is a town in Sweden that makes this giant Yule Goat, Galve. I think I did a video about that a little while ago. I think it's called like the Yule Goat. And people try and set it on fire every year. It's a super fascinating story. Some years they succeed, some years they don't. Each year they put up like high fences and security cameras, but still, hooligans will sneak in and set it on fire. So there's this whole tradition of lighting the Yule Goat on fire, but you don't have to. After all, they're not super easy to either create yourself or to purchase. So I'm planning, I want really big ones. I'm going to buy 2 really big ones at the base of my Yule tree, I think, for next year. And I don't plan on burning them, but you can if you'd like. Let's see. Let me find a couple last questions here. Let's see. Okay. Leah is asking, is Jack Frost based on any deities? Good question. Possibly, especially when we look at Slavic paganism, where they have a lot more deities that are kind of personified versions of winter. So maybe in that vein, but great question. I should look into that. That's a good one. Let's see. Wednesday's asking about the Belsnickel, if I have a video on him. I recently learned that there is a Belsnickel tradition from America. And this was kind of like an American version of Krampus that faded out. Something I need to look into more. I do want to probably do a video on him in the future. And it's a shame that this tradition kind of faded out here. Let's see. Oh, I have a request to talk more about Finnish paganism. Definitely want to do that in the future. Let's see. Okay. Okay, awesome. Let's see. Someone's asking me what I thought about the book and show American Gods. It's a really good book. It's written by Neil Gaiman. The characters are mostly based on deities. So different pagan gods and goddesses. Highly recommend, reading the book if you're, a pagan. It's just kind of fun to read fiction that features different gods and goddesses. Yeah, I read it and it's a good one. Let's see. Someone's giving me a tip here. Nut was the goddess of the night sky in ancient Egypt. Thank you for that. I totally forgot that one. Joey's asking, was Christmas at one point banned in the US because it was too pagan? Christmas in many areas has been banned because it was too pagan. So that has happened periodically throughout many areas, throughout many time periods. Mostly it was about like the decorations. Like you can't decorate for Christmas. You're bringing in all of this like greenery, like trees. It's super pagan, so they didn't like it. So yes, that is something that definitely happened. And it's so funny, today when you'll go in churches and you'll see them all decked out. Some of them have Christmas trees inside of them. And you're like, okay, we really know what's going on. Let's see. Awesome. Let's see. Well, I think this is probably a good point to sign off for today. I really hope you enjoyed this chat about Norse pagan Yule celebrations. I really wanted to bring in some historical research for you guys so that you could get a bit of a better idea on what were some of the ways that the actual Norse pagans were celebrating. What were they doing and when were they celebrating and how were they celebrating? And of course, this is just a small slice of the material out there. So I encourage you to do your own research, to get out there, have some fun. And of course, with paganism, you are welcome to celebrate Yule in any way that you would like. There is no rule book here. So do what feels right. And thank you guys so much for watching. We are getting close to Yule. I have a really big next week. I'm closing on the house on Thursday. And then I'll be moving shortly, basically like on Yule. So it's going to be a little wild for me, but I'm going to keep doing my pagan happy hours for you all. We have a super chat before I sign off from Thunderstorm. Thank you so much. That says, let's see. Hi, my only source is old ladies that taught me about the old gods. And that Boulder in the story wanted to die as he was in love with Hela, their daughter being Autumn. Ooh, I haven't heard this version, but thank you for sharing. That sounds super interesting. I know there are multiple versions of this story. So thank you so much for the super chat. I really appreciate your support. And thank you guys so much for joining me for our little Yule chat. And I'll see you next Friday. Bye.